John Delaney, and he is a former congressman three-term congressman from Maryland. He's been in the state for quite some time, and he has visited, he's the only one I think who's visited all 99 counties here in Iowa, and he has also done, he was the first candidate to do conversations with candidates on a nationwide conference. So at this time, I would like to introduce to you Mr. John Delaney.
Well, good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
How's the conference going so far? I'll sit. I do what the senator tells me to do. Well, I'll be brief because I know we're going to have an engaging conversation. I just want to start by thanking you for having me and thanking you for the work you do to advance what I believe is one of the great equality challenges in our nation, to make sure our citizens who have a disability have equality in all the important institutions in our society so that they can pursue their own individual pursuit of happiness and have the benefits that are available to every citizen. And I'm committed, as someone who's running for president in 2020 and as your president, to make deep reforms to the institutions that exist in our society, whether they be the institutions of education, of healthcare, of transportation, of retirement benefits, of housing, most importantly, all of these institutions that shape the lives of every American, ensuring that they are reformed in a way that actually creates the kind of equality that we know the community with disability in our country needs. So I'm grateful to be here to have this conversation, and I'm most looking forward to our discussion. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. People with disabilities make up a significant segment of our society, and yet for far too long have been largely excluded from politics. In 2016, 62.7 million eligible voters were expected to either have a disability or had a household member with one, according to researchers at Rutgers University. In other words, more than 25% of the total electorate have a personal connection to a disability. There are only a few recognizable elected officials who have a visible disability: Senator Tammy Duckworth, Representative Langevin, and Texas Governor Abbott. But organizations like the National Council for Independent Living and the amazing work of Sarah Bahalvik and Neil Carter creating the Elevate campaign training for people with disabilities, we hope to see our community represented more equitably. What are your plans to increase employment opportunity for people with disabilities?
Well, there's several things I think we need to do, and I think you framed the question perfectly, because the issues that are important to people with disabilities have not been front and center in our political discourse, and that's in part because we've also made it difficult for people with disabilities to participate in the political process. So it's kind of been there's been two problems that we've had to deal with. One of the key aspects of being engaged from an employment perspective is making sure you have the skills that you need. So I think we can't have a conversation about ensuring employment opportunities for people with disabilities unless we talk about apprenticeship programs, which I think are so important to giving people the skills that they need, particularly in the world that we live in now, where things are changing so fast. And there's so much economic kind of dynamism, if you will, in terms of the skills that people need to be successfully employed. And so I think we need 5 million new apprenticeships in this country to begin with. And I think there needs to be a significant allocation of those apprenticeships to people with disabilities. And we need to make sure those apprenticeship programs have the funding so they can develop the program so that people with disabilities can access them successfully. And that really creates the pathway for people with disability to be engaged in the workforce. But it also starts with the public education system, because unless we have a public education system that is serving all of our students, including young people with disabilities, then they're not going to be set up to be able to be in apprenticeship programs to get that next, to get that job opportunity that they need. So those are some of the things that I would focus on in terms of getting people more engaged in the workforce if they have a disability.
Have you given any consideration to how companies and businesses could be encouraged or incentivized to employ those with disabilities without taking advantage by paying inadequate wages? What do you see as the most significant issues surrounding that?
Well, I for one am against the ability of companies to pay sub-minimum wage to people with disabilities. So I don't think, and I've heard arguments why people think these programs could make sense in certain situations, but in general, I believe in the dignity of work, and you should get paid fairly for the work that you do. So in general, I'm not in favor of those programs. Because I think everyone can make a contribution, and everyone's contribution should be valued equally and fairly. So if people with disabilities are doing a job, companies shouldn't be able to get off with paying them less than what they'd have to pay anyone else to do the job. So I'm against those policies, very, very strongly, actually. But there are things companies can do. Prior to running for Congress, I started 2 businesses from scratch, took them public, created thousands of jobs. So I actually ended up running some good-sized businesses. And I always wanted to make my I not only wanted to have a diverse workforce that was representative of everyone in our society, including people with disabilities, but I wanted to make sure we had an accessible workforce. So I think there are things, in addition to passing laws to requiring people to do things, I think there are incentives that can be created to encourage employers to, A, have apprenticeship programs for people with disabilities. That's an easy place for the federal government to create incentives, meaning if you run an apprenticeship program, you can get some grant money. If you actually develop them specifically for people with disabilities, that's a terrific way to do it. And I think in general, ensuring that the infrastructure in our country, the public transportation system in our country, the things that people rely upon to successfully engage in the workforce are accessible, clearly creates a workforce where people with disabilities are more represented.
The majority of United States citizens have their essential needs met: housing, food, water, rest, and a basic level of security. Unfortunately, individuals with disabilities and other minorities are still fighting for these basic needs. For if they were met, we could be productive and may even be less costly for the government in many ways. 29 years after the ADA and 20 years after the Supreme Court Olmstead decision, it almost feels unreal that many Iowans on Medicaid who rely on broken long-term support services are struggling to stay physically and mentally healthy in their homes and actually having to consider moving into nursing homes due to discriminatory policies and a shortage of caregivers. People with disabilities are dependent upon finding in-home health care in order to avoid being placed in a group home or assisted living or nursing home. What will your administration do to ensure that someone with a disability is not forced out of their domicile in order to produce daily health care? Procure daily health care, sorry.
Well, you have to fund home care, and you have to fund it at both the Medicaid and the Medicare level, right? Because one of the incentives that people think exist in our healthcare system right now, and I think it's a mistake, is they view institutional long-term care as more cost-effective, when in reality it's not, because it prevents people from being engaged and productive in society, which not only negatively affects them, but it also affects their productivity and ultimately ends up costing us all more. So I think home care has a very good return on investment. My first business was actually in the home care business, so I know a fair amount about the home care business. And the problem with home care is reimbursement rates. Reimbursement rates are just way too low. And so it becomes very hard to build provider networks. And that's particularly true at the Medicaid level. What's happened here in Iowa with the privatization of Medicaid is just terrible. It's just terrible, because as best I can tell, what the state did is they brought in a private company who they paid a pretty fair economic margin to simply cut costs with providers. That's all they did, right? They basically paid someone to go and cut reimbursement rates. And I've been at, I was at the LINK program in Des Moines, and they explained to me how they had a 20% reduction in their reimbursement rates. And I know the state hasn't saved 20% on their Medicaid bills. So effectively, a lot of margin is going directly to the private company that they brought in. So if you want to have good home care programs, you have to have good reimbursement rates so that you actually have caregivers. And you have to understand that home care is really the lowest cost way of supporting someone who needs medical care when you factor all the aspects into in capturing the costs.
Access to affordable and reliable transportation allows people with disabilities important opportunities to go to school, work, take care of their health, live where they desire, and participate in all aspects of community life. Because our nation's investments in transportation infrastructure have disproportionately favored vehicles and highways, those who cannot afford vehicles, or do not operate vehicles often lack viable transportation options. Many candidates have talked about the need to invest in infrastructure. What specifically would you do to ensure that the accessibility and inclusion are included in your plan for our nation's infrastructure and the jobs that come with it?
So I led the largest bipartisan effort around infrastructure in the Congress of the United States. I had a specific proposal that I led that ended up having 40 Democrats and 40 Republicans in the House and 10 Democrats and 10 Republicans in the Senate, creating $1 trillion infrastructure program. So I think infrastructure, if structured appropriately, can get broad bipartisan support, and it's a tragedy that we haven't done it. What you're getting at is the fact that we over-allocate funding towards traditional transportation, and we under-allocate it towards public transportation. And, you know, I think that has lots of implications, including on our ability to deal with climate change, by the way. But that's another topic. But it also affects this community. And it was funny, there was an editor in the Washington Post a couple weeks ago, and they were talking about the D.C. metro system, which has come under some criticism. Rightfully so. They've had some operational issues. But in the scheme of things, the operational issues have not been, I think, all that significant. But there's an article every day about how bad the D.C. metro system is. And there was a horrible tragedy several years ago where a rider lost their life. But that has been one over the last 5 years. One metro rider has lost their life riding the D.C. metro system. And something like 400 people lose their lives on the Washington Beltway every year. And no one ever talks about that. So there's just this standard that we hold our public transportation system that allows people to just continue to argue against funding it. And I just think it's wrong. I mean, we have to make investments in the sustainable infrastructure of the future, but we also have to recognize that smart and accessible public transportation allows people to participate much more robustly in society, and it's good for them. You know, Sweden has this interesting thing. You know those crossing signs where they give you a certain amount of time to cross the street? Well, in Sweden, all those signs are 50% longer than they are in the United States of America. So you have 50% more time to cross. And they did an analysis, and they said, well, this allows our seniors and our citizens with disabilities to be more active in society because they feel more comfortable that they can actually cross the street. Kind of makes sense. And it makes them go out more, and it makes them engage more. And there's no question that the more engaged you are intellectually and physically, it allows you to age more successfully. And it actually saves a lot of money on healthcare costs. So you actually have to think about how all of this stuff is interrelated, which is you want to build a society where people have mobility and accessibility, because that's not only good for them as human beings in terms of being able to fulfill their full potential, but it also is good for society as a whole, because more engaged citizens do live more productive lives. They do contribute more productively to society, and it's been proven that they live healthier lives. And so I just think we have to capture all of the costs and benefits when we think about these decisions. You know, when we think about how much time someone should have to cross the street, what that means if you create a little more time in terms of allowing people with disabilities and our seniors to be out and you know, active in society.
Thank you. Technology. Accessible mainstream communication and information technologies, as well as assistive and adaptive technologies, often allow people with disabilities to secure and maintain employment, participate in educational activities, and experience entertainment like everybody else. The recent Domino's Pizza case was a success, but many websites are not accessible for all. Would you make it a priority to ensure federal agencies made their websites and all information technology accessible? And how would you implement this?
The answer to your question is yes, I would make it a priority. And the nice thing about this area that you're talking about is this is something where ultimately you want to pass laws. We need the American for Disability Act 2.0, if you will, on a lot of these areas. And Senator Harkin, who's been a hero on these issues, I know just left. He was with you before I joined. But we really need to get to the American for Disabilities Act version 2.0 to address some of these things. But a lot of the things you're talking about can be done by executive authority. In other words, the executive branch of the United States has the power to put forth rules about things like accessibility. So it would be one of the first executive orders that I sign, which is putting in best practices with respect to accessibility in anything that touches the U.S. government. And that would be a commitment that I would make.
What steps will your administration take to address the digital divide to ensure that all people with disabilities have access to the internet, including those who rely on Social Security income support?
So, and this also ties into your prior question, which I didn't address, which is we need to ensure that every single citizen of this country has access to high-speed communications. And we know there are huge parts of our countries, very often in rural America, but also in many cases in urban and suburban America, where because of costs, et cetera, where they don't have access to high-speed communications. In my view, that is a basic right of citizenship at this point. Because you, in 2019 in the United States of America, unless you have access to high-speed communication, you are largely shut out of a lot of things that are incredibly important to your life. So I view this, if you think about basic rights that I believe we deserve as citizens, things like basic right to a good public education, basic right to health care, which I think is, by the way, a basic human right. But I think basic rights to access high-speed communication, when you think about how many private and government services are depending upon you having access to that, that has to be a basic right. So as part of any national infrastructure program that I launch, I will ensure that at the end of the day, everyone is connected to high-speed communication in this country. And I think it'll pay for itself 20 times over. Because I think the enhanced productivity, think about how much extraordinary talent exists within the community of people with disabilities in our country that is not being tapped because it's not being accessed, right? These things have huge multiplier effects on them. And so, you know, I think that ensuring that everyone is connected digitally to the modern economy and to where government services should go is an absolute priority of will be an absolute priority of my administration.
Thank you. We're going to shift gears now into healthcare, so I'm going to invite Dr. Cindy Hanawalt to come up.
Kind of hand about dropping things. Hello, nice to meet you. Well, I want to thank you for coming today.
Thank you for having me.
And I appreciate, and we'll step right into our discussion, but your discussion today about coverage for home health care. I spend half a day a week in a wound clinic here in Cedar Rapids, and I'm finding it so difficult to heal pressure ulcers. And so individuals that are wheelchair dependent, paraplegic, we're having difficulty sometimes offloading to provide them with the access to heal by taking the pressure off. And so what we're finding is individuals do not have the support coming into their home to help them transition in and out of their wheelchairs, in and out of their beds. And so that creates a problem. And we're also finding that we have to document certain things in our notes. So when individuals come in with staging of wounds and those type of things, and I'm spending a lot of time having to say certain buzzwords in my notes, or insurance wants to reject the services that I order. So I'm spending time with that. I have a patient now who she's probably at the point we're going to have to institutionalize her because we can't get her wound to heal because we can't get the proper mattress. And so coming in, if I want to order a certain line of mattresses, I have to prove she's had 30 days of failing this particular device. And the scenario goes on. And so we're seeing a lot of administrative burdens with trying to provide care. And so I'm interested, when you talk about healthcare coverage, sort of can you give us specifics about what your insight is in dealing with some of these problems?
Sure. So let me start by saying I believe that we should have a universal healthcare system in this country. And I think people who are advocating for something other than a universal healthcare system are really misunderstanding how broken our healthcare system is in this country. And I think healthcare is a basic human right. I think it's also smart economic policy. You know, I only started my first business because my wife, April, was working and we were having our first child, and I wouldn't have left my job to start a business and have us uninsured when we were about to expect our first child. And so I was able to do that because April was working, and my company ended up creating 2,000 jobs. So I think there's a lot of stories like that out there. So I think healthcare is a basic human right, and I think it's smart economic policy. I think people calling for public options and stuff like that, they're not really understanding how broken our system is. Now, having said that, there's a lot of ways of achieving universal healthcare. And there's a very popular version of that right now called Medicare for All, which is a single-payer universal healthcare system, meaning the government is the only payer. That's actually a very rare way of accomplishing universal healthcare around the world. Most countries that have a universal healthcare system have a mixed model, like Germany does. And that's what I'm proposing with my Better Care program, where everyone gets basic health care from the government for free as a right of citizenship. But then they have the ability to buy supplementals, opt out, get insurance from their employers, et cetera. And I think that's a much more successful way to accomplish universal health care for two important reasons. One, it gives the American people's choice, while also ensuring that everyone has health care as a basic human right. So no one's left behind, but they get choices. But two, it gets to our comments about home health care, which is it's very important in this country to make sure we pay providers enough. If you don't pay people enough, you're not going to get them to do the job. Let's just face it. And people like to say, well, they should just do it anyhow. That's not the way the world works. You know, in the state of New Hampshire, where I also spend a lot of time, I know I shouldn't say that here in Iowa, they reimburse for a mental health visit $18 a visit under their Medicaid program. $18 a visit. Vermont, state right next door, reimburses like 3 times that. It shouldn't be a surprise to anyone that there's very little mental health professionals accepting Medicaid in the state of New Hampshire, and there's abundant number of them in Vermont. And New Hampshire has an opioid crisis. So the problem I have with the single-payer system is that there's ample evidence to suggest that the government never pays enough. Medicaid only pays 80% of costs, Medicare pays 90% of costs, and commercial insurance pays 120% of costs. So I like a mixed model, because if you go to most hospitals and you ask them how it would go for them if all of their rates were paid at Medicare rates, most hospitals would say that they would close. So I don't want to be overly strident. I'm a pragmatic idealist. My ideal is universal health care. Everyone gets health care as a basic human right, no exceptions, and for free. Full stop. But I want people to have choices, because I think they like choices, and I also think it puts more revenues in the healthcare system, which allows for there to be more providers. And I think one of the great challenges in our country right now is a lack of providers providing care to people who need it.
Thank you. So, and I think we're all feeling that crunch a little bit. The reality of being in Iowa, though.
You're a provider.
I am a provider. I've been an independent provider for 18 years. And so, you know, I've shared with my colleagues, it's like, you know, it was really nice to sort of practice that Marcus Welby type of medicine. And I love my job. But it became too difficult because Medicare wanted to only reimburse me of half of what it cost me to get immunizations to my geriatric patients. And so we're trying to do what we love in a setting that is not supporting us. And if we have time for one more question with you. So that leads into what we're seeing right now with physician burnout. And so some of us are thinking about, providers, we take it personally, like, why can't we keep up? We need to be able to keep our doors open. We have to pay our staff. And yet that means we have to see more patients, which means that that's more work at the end of the day. So I'd like to learn a little bit more of how you can help us with physician burnout.
Well, one of the reasons I think a lot of physician burnout occurs because of bureaucracy and paperwork and the Byzantine nature of our healthcare system, which is one of the reasons I want a universal system, because I think it'll start grinding that down. And I hate to use the word grinding it, but that's how it's going to work. We're not going to wave a magic wand and all the bureaucracy in healthcare go away. It's a fifth of our economy. So we have to start realizing we're in this incredibly technology-enabled world, and we got to start streamlining these platforms and make them more efficient for physicians. We also have to make things easier for physicians. It's too expensive to go to medical school. There's too much debt. Interest rates are too high. People like you who have a real mission behind it, I can tell just by talking with you, you're animated much more by the mission. You'd probably do it if you got paid half of what you get paid, right? So, but we can't rely on everyone being like that, right? We have to make sure people will go to rural communities and practice and get paid fairly to do it. So we have to increase physician reimbursement rates. We got to do things to make cost of medical school, which is always going to be expensive, right, because it's a complicated thing, but make it more affordable. And then we got to eliminate the bureaucracy. That's what I would do.
All right. So it looks like we just have one more minute. So when you talk about sort of this universal health care, I think we're still stuck in our mind about what happens in general is that we try to have more Blue Cross Blue Shield because that's a higher reimbursement. But a lot of private payers now are going to base their pay scale on what Medicaid and Medicare is doing. And so that still doesn't help. I mean, 17% of our rural hospitals are at risk of closing right now because we have such a high percentage of Medicare-aged patients. And so I'm still trying to have a better understanding of how this universal plan will work.
So under my universal plan called Medicare, you leave Medicare alone. You give everyone else basic federal health care as a right of citizenship. They get it from when they're born to they're 65, then they go to Medicare. And the rates would be similar to Medicare. But they have options. They can buy supplemental plans, which is, a lot of Medicare beneficiaries do. 80% of them do, by the way. Or they could buy their own private insurance, or they could get their private insurance from their company. In other words, they could opt out, which is what Medicare beneficiaries do when they get Medicare Advantage, by the way. And if they did that, they'd get a tax credit because they wouldn't be using their government health insurance, right? They'd be not using something they're entitled to. And they could use that tax credit towards the cost of whatever private insurance either they or their employers provide. So you'd have a mixed model where everyone would be covered, and then some people would opt out, and other people would buy supplementals. And the other thing I'd like to do is kind of relaunch what used to be called the disproportionate share payment, where hospitals in struggling communities actually, there's a recognition by the government that they're probably under-reimbursed for what they do, and they get a direct payment from the government to support the fact that they're operating in that market.
Thank you. I think our time's up. Thank
Okay,
you so much.
great,
I appreciate
thank you. That was a
being
great
here.
conversation.
Thank you.
And one other thing about healthcare before we go out, this will be 10 seconds. We talk all about the cost of healthcare, which is, we spend a lot of money on healthcare, but we also employ a lot of people in healthcare. So this is, let's focus on the quality of the outcomes and ensuring access, because you cut a lot of healthcare costs, you're going to cut a lot of jobs in this country.
Thank you, Mr. Delaney. And if you want to give us a closing,
Sure.
that would be great.
So your issues are very important to me for a personal reason. And I mentioned this story last night. I don't know how many people were at the dinner last night. But one of my grandfathers came to this country in 1923 with his 7 brothers and sisters and his mother. On August 1st, 1923, 15 ships steamed into Ellis Island, delivering 15,000 immigrants into our country, all of them looking for a better life. One of them was my grandfather. He was a little boy. He came with his 7 brothers and sisters and his mother. But the day didn't go well for him when he arrived. His 7 brothers and sisters were led into the country, as was his mother. But he was stopped. A little boy coming into Ellis Island in 1923. He was stopped. He was separated from his family. he was detained, and he was scheduled for deportation. So the reason they did this to him is because he had one arm, and he was considered disabled. And back then, in 1923, we didn't let people into our country who were disabled, even if they were a little boy. So he was detained for weeks, and he was going to be deported back, but his family got him an appeal. And the appeal was held in the Great Hall of Ellis Island. And I remember him telling the story. He was scared. He was in the back of the room. There were hundreds of people waiting to have their appeals heard by this judge. And there was very little hope because the rules were clear. If you were disabled, you weren't allowed in the country. And I actually found his chart from Ellis Island, and they had a little picture, they had a drawing of a body, and they had a big X through his arm, indicating that he didn't have an arm. But hope actually arrived in the form of the judge. And as my grandfather was sitting there waiting for his hearing, the judge walks in, and my grandfather saw that the judge also had one arm. So the only reason my grandfather, who was a little boy, was let into this country is because the one-armed judge looked at the one-armed boy and said, I'm going to let you in, but make something of your life. So there's a little bit of shared humanity back in 1923 allowed my grandfather, who was a little boy and was disabled, into this country. And that obviously, in ways I can never even fully describe, changed my life. So it's an example of how everyone is equal and everyone deserves a fair shot, no matter what the circumstances. So that's why your issues are personal to me. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you very much. He will be here for about another 10 minutes. We're going to do very strict timelines now because we have all the other candidates lined up. So Mr. John Delaney, over here.